Hi, Sebastian Weissenberger here with my colleagues Omer Chouinard and Mélanie Madore from University of Moncton. Today we're going to talk to you about a project we did on crisis, post-crisis management and resilience building after the spring floods of 2018 in New Brunswick. That project was financed by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reductions, ICLR, and the Marine Emergency Observation and Response Network, MIOPA, and consisted mainly in interviews with various stakeholders. It was piloted by the University of Moncton. So New Brunswick is part of the Maritime Provinces in eastern Canada. And our study region is specifically in the south of the province, so that's the coast that is on the Bay of Fundy, which is itself part of the Gulf of Maine. And it's the estuary of the St. John River. The St. John River runs from Quebec through New Brunswick, and parts of its drainage basin is also in Maine and ends up in St. John. So Fredericton and St. John are the two main cities in that area. It is an area that has experienced a lot of risks of floods in the past, starting the first recorded one in 1696, and with other important storms in 1973 and in 2008, and then again in 2018, which we'll talk about today, and further floods in 2019. And on top of river floods, it's also an area that often has extreme weather events. In the Bay of Fundy, different types of storms, which are either northeastern storms, such as the Saxby Gale in 1869, or tropical storms that are the remnants of hurricane from the Gulf of Mexico that make their way up the eastern seaboard. So the floods of 2018 were quite significant. They're considered one of the most important floods that happened in the region. And why they were so important is that there was an early onset of spring with a period of very high temperatures for the season, which caused a rapid ice melt and a strong increase in river levels. And at the same time, this coincided with high spring tides at the mouth of the St. John River, which caused water to accumulate there and further contributed to the rise in water levels. And these conditions lasted for quite a lot longer than previous floods, so about 2 weeks long of floods, which also contributed to the destruction and disruption caused by this storm. The impacts were mostly flooding of infrastructure and homes. So about 12,000 homes were damaged, 1,500 people were displaced and had to be hosted by the Red Cross. There were over 40 road closures, including the Trans-Canada Highway, and some communities were could not be reached by road anymore, so they had to be evacuated through the Coast Guard. And that led to high costs, probably about $80 million in damage in the region, and about 3,000 damage reports were filed, and 1,200 requests for compensation were filed with the province. And then in the next year there were again new floods that happened, as some people hadn't even recovered from previous floods. And that happens in a context where there's been an accumulation of such events, starting with the winter storms of 2010 that caused extended coastal flooding, several hurricanes like Irene in 2011, Arthur in 2013, or Dorian in 2019 that went over New Brunswick, or the ice storm of 2017 that caused a lot of destruction in northeastern New Brunswick. So definitely extreme weather events have become increasingly frequent and destructive, and are certainly a challenge now for communities everywhere in New Brunswick. There are some particularities in the governance of New Brunswick that makes management of those events more difficult. One is that a third of the population lives in local service districts, which are territories which do not have mayors or any other elected representatives, and no planning tools as well, spatial planning or emergency planning. And there's also a large number of small municipalities that really lack the resources to adequately integrate climate change in the emergency planning or in the land planning. So to deal with all this situation, there was a local governance reform in 2011 by the province of New Brunswick, which created 12 regional service commissions. And those regional service commissions are there to assist small municipalities and local service districts in various tasks, but including land use planning and emergency measures. And there was also the creation of regional emergency measures organizations coordinators. There used to be 6 of them, and now they doubled the number to 12 of them. So the same number. Every region now has a EMO coordinator from the province. So let's talk about our project a bit. The objective of the province was to see how governance played out in response to the extreme weather events, such as the 2018 spring flood. And in the response, we articulated that according to 3 timescales. One, during the event, so the immediate response, which is the organization of emergency measures. Then the second phase of a slightly long middle term, it's the recovery phase, what happens after the event. And the third phase, the long-term planning, that is how emergency measures and land planning is reorganized in order to deal with or reduce the impacts of future events. So that's the aspect really of resilience building in those communities. The project went through a series of semi-directed interviews with various stakeholders that are involved in the response to crisis response. So there were some people from regional service commissions we talked to. There were group interviews with municipal planners of St. John and Fredericton, the 2 larger cities. And we also talked to the Canadian Coast Guard and the Canadian Red Cross. And unfortunately, due to the timing of the study, we were not able to talk to provincial representatives for various reasons, and it was also not possible to approach really respondents from small municipalities, as they were over the head with dealing with the outfall of the crisis itself. So we had an interview scheme that we applied and adjusted to the specific respondents that we talked to. But you will see that some questions were asked to all the participants. And then we tried to identify different themes which were either imposed by us or were emerged during the course of the interview. So we did some content analysis on that. The first large theme, it's everything that deals with the event itself, and the vulnerability. So everybody mentioned that it was a highly stressful time, this whole crisis management, that this was a particular flood event that was comparable to really the worst floods that have been in recent history, that some of the people remembered. And that there were also different types of inundations, but let's not get into those details. The vulnerability was really mainly linked to the presence of homes and of infrastructure in flood zones, and especially the access to bridges, which disrupted transport a lot, and therefore made a lot of essential services, such as hospitals or fire stations, not available or couldn't reach certain parts of town. And there's also the fact that several municipal or provincial buildings are in flood zones themselves, so that is a problem for governance. The next theme we addressed was emergency planning, and actually most respondents were very positive about that. There was a very good interplay of the various levels of governance. Everybody used the incident command system, which is a sort of centralized and well-organized flowchart system. People came in from outside of the province to help. Even 2 ICS experts from Alberta were flown in, and the Coast Guard and the Army came, and everybody worked very well together. And the large cities and the province had also done extensive preparation for those emergency measures, so that's why it worked so well. There were, however, throughout the whole period, difficulties with transport due to the closure of so many roads. The role of NGOs was also singled out, such as the Salvation Army or the Red Cross play a very important part in relocating people. Individual volunteers can be helpful, but can be a problem as well for managers, since they have to manage a large number of volunteers. And for example, the Red Cross actually does not take any spontaneous volunteers. They only work with long-term collaborators that have been trained. As far as relocation and recovery is concerned, there were several problems singled out with that. One is that really eventual relocation and recovery is mostly people are left to their individual devices, their insurances, trying to go through the province or the federal to get some reimbursements, and even come the winter after the spring floods, there were a lot of people that were still living in temporary shelters or even in caravans in front of their homes, which is very problematic in winter at that time. So there's definitely room for improvement in that respect. And as far as long-term adaptation planning is concerned, pretty much all respondents saw an important part of climate change and of changes that they had observed, an increase in the number and in the frequency and the destructiveness of events, and expect that to happen in the future. So, for example, both large cities are actively engaged in planning for climate change adaptation. Strategies may vary. For example, Fredericton has a strategy of incremental adaptation, which means that every time that infrastructure is upgraded or has to be renewed, it is augmented to be able to cope with future climate change. And that's, of course, if that's done in the course of normal maintenance, that reduces the cost of adaptation by so much. So mainstreaming climate change into the whole of municipal decision making. One particular problem is the existence of vulnerable zones. That is, for example, in Fredericton, 650 units of housing which are known to be in flood-prone zones. And retreat is certainly considered in the long term, but there's no short-term planning to do that. And the municipalities also do not want to have anything to do with that aspect, and say that's the responsibility of the province to relocate people if they have to be relocated. And finally, a lot of people mentioned the collaboration with the experts and academic sector. That was very important. So, for example, Fredericton has been collaborating for the University of Waterloo for 15 years, and many EMO managers that we interviewed had followed online courses on risk and emergency management. So overall, we concluded that the emergency response itself was considered excellent, and that a lot of preparation has gone into it, that actors have learned from previous events and refined their techniques, and that there was also the aspect of solidarity between different actors that was stressed out and very positive. So, of course, large cities and small communities are not at all in the same boat concerning this problem. They don't have the same resources and the same networks as well. Large cities are autonomous in their response, and communities rely on the province to help them. So there's a big difference. And every actor, whether it's the authorities, the NGOs, or citizen volunteers, play different roles in adaptation, which are all important. Recovery, on the other hand, it's really no one's responsibility in principle, and insurance and federal schemes can be very long to process, which leaves people really vulnerable to, vulnerable. And long-term adaptation is judged essential by everybody there. Climate change is definitely a part of that. There is a focus on services and infrastructures to be available even during events. And of course, the question of flood zones, how they are addressed, and the creation of buffer zones, for example, for flood events. One open question is whether people in risk zones need to be relocated. So the answer would, in theory, be probably yes, that would be a good idea. But in practice, nobody really wants to be responsible for that. And finally, the collaboration of science and governance is really important and an active field. So the province is also leading currently a consultation process, which I don't have the results yet, should be finished by now, and will draw its own conclusions from this process. So that was that in a few words, and thanks for your attention, and I hope we have time for some questions. So thank you.